Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to Camera Position episode number 3. I hope you're enjoying listening to the podcasts. What I'd like to do for this episode is talk not about one of my own photographs, but rather about a photograph that I admire by one of my very favorite photographers, photographer Paul Caponigro, one of the great masters of the 20th and 21st century. Not to be confused with his equally talented and all-around good guy son, John Paul Caponigro, but this is John Paul's father. The photograph I'd like to discuss for this issue of Camera Position is a photograph that Paul Caponigro entitled Two Leaves, Brewster, New York. It's a photograph that he made in 1963, and it's one that has always fascinated me. I would call it one of my desert island photographs. It's a picture that obviously Caponigro liked a great deal as well, because it was chosen as the cover image for his book, The Wise Silence. And when I look at this photograph, I guess what it is that fascinates me is the way space is used in the photograph. He's really changed the way we perceive space. Generally, in images, we tend to believe that light values will travel towards us and darker values will travel farther away. But he sort of inverted that idea here by putting the high-lit leaf way in the back of the image, and this darker leaf kind of projecting out into the space very close to us. And in fact, if you look closely, there's a very shallow depth of field in the photograph as it projects towards us. That leaf that comes towards us is very, very slightly out of focus. But what really fascinates me is the idea that these objects sort of are floating in space. And as we look at the photograph, what we're looking at here is this undulating line that goes through the back of the picture from top left to bottom right. Very faint, very dark tone, very carefully controlled. And the idea, I think, is that what happens is that dark line really changes the way we see the space in the picture. Instead of these two leaves just sort of floating in the middle of a void, that undulating line gives some sense of presence, some sense of place, but not a specific sense of place. So we're still sort of mystified as to what it is that these pictures, this photograph is, and where we are in space. We know that it's two leaves, we can identify those, but there is something so wonderfully ambiguous about the way in which these leaves sort of float in a space that is sort of not connected to the earth. But now it becomes even more interesting because I have these two images to share with you. These are two images that Paul Caponigro made before he made, or perhaps I guess after, I suppose is entirely possible. And I don't really know the sequence of this, but pictures that were made at the same time, on the same day, of the same material. And we can really see in these photographs the way a photographer works his subject, and the idea of how photographers sort of stalk their subject in some ways. And so if we look at these two pictures, we can see that he's moving in closer. He's interested in the idea of the value shift between the young leaves and the older leaves. He's interested in these sort of edges that undulate throughout the leaves. And yet there's something else that's going on here in terms of how he thinks through the process of making these pictures. And I really find it fascinating that the one he eventually chose to use as certainly as a book cover and as one of his most I think one of his most enigmatic and certainly one of his most interesting and popular images is the one that is pared down to the essence. It is the least amount of information that is necessary for us to see these leaves, but also it becomes something else. It's one of those things that is both a photograph of what it is, but also it becomes so much more. And that, I think, is what makes the picture interesting. So that's it for this episode of Camera Position number 3. I hope you're interested in what we're talking about. Please drop me a line at jeff@jeffcurto.com or jeff@cameraposition.com. I'd love to hear from you, and hope that you'll stay tuned for our future episodes of Camera Position. Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 4 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative aspects of photography. For episode number 4, I'd like to talk about another one of my photographs. This is a photograph that is entitled Calle del Forno, Venezia. The Calle del Forno is a calle in Venice is a sort of side street, and forno is an oven. So this is the street of the oven. And there's sort of a kind of a funny story, I guess, that goes along with this particular photograph. And the story is that I got to this particular location and noticed a small boy, 10, 12 years old, who was poling a boat back and forth across the canal. And I thought that made a rather interesting idea for a photograph, so I began to set up my camera, and I use a large format of 4x5 camera, so it takes me a couple of minutes, 2 or 3 minutes, to set up the camera and get the thing ready to go, and then another couple of minutes to get the camera focused and figure exposure and all of the basic aspects of technical aspects of photography. So I set up the camera and I got the thing composed and focused, and of course, by that time, the small boy was gone, and I walked over to the edge of the canal and looked down the canal in both directions, and there he was, off to the right, way down the canal, maybe a couple of 100 yards down. And so I had some time, so I sat and I waited for him and waited for him and waited for him. And as I waited, I realized that there were some other interesting things going on. Most notably, I really enjoyed this laundry that was blowing ever so slightly in the wind. So while I was waiting, I made some exposures of that part of the scene and varied the length of time and waited for different amounts of wind to kind of blow the laundry, and made several different pictures, and was there for perhaps, I don't know, an hour or so. And then eventually I decided, the boy's never coming back. I'll just pack up the camera and go. And of course, just as I got the last piece of camera equipment back into my bag and folded up my tripod, here comes the boy poling his boat back down the canal. But the lesson I learned was that there is always a photograph somewhere if you take the time to really look carefully enough. Of course, my initial impression here was that the photograph was a photograph of this particular child who is doing this thing in this boat, but in reality, what the photograph was the difference between the dark wall on the left hand of the photograph, left-hand side of the photograph, the sunlit aspect of this beautiful Venetian window and balcony in the center part of the photograph, and this wonderful blowing sheet or other part of laundry material that was happening on the left, and how that contrasted so beautifully against this dark wall. So the lesson I learned was that maybe the photograph you think is there really isn't there, but there's always something there to look at, and always something in which you can find an interesting aspect to make a photograph of. So I guess the lesson is, if you think there's a photograph there, keep looking, and in fact you'll probably find one. Thanks for joining me. I'd certainly love to hear from anybody who's out there listening and find out what your interests are in photography and what kinds of photography you like looking at. Come and visit me at cameraposition.com or at jeffcurto.com, and send me an email at jeff@jeffcurto.com. I'd love to hear from you and love to hear your reaction to the podcast and to photography in general. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time on the next episode of Camera Position, an enhanced podcast about the creative side of photography. Hi, this is Jeff Curto, and welcome to episode number 5 of Camera Position, a podcast about the creative side of photography. Today I'd like to talk about another one of my photographs, this one made in rural Tuscany of a group of sheep, pecore as the Italians would say. And boy, these sheep in the morning hours, I was staying in a farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere in the wilds of Tuscany, and it was not a place where I was able to sleep late because the sheep would be driven by the shepherds up over the hill just a little bit to the left of the picture space here at about 5:30 every morning, and every sheep has a bell around its neck, so it would be a gentle but and quite beautiful but early morning every morning. Uh, as I watched these animals, one of the things that I was really fascinated by was the way in which they followed one another. It seemed as though one sheep would move and the others would follow behind. And I was interested in the fact that they seemed to make these sort of trails through the space, trails that only they were defining. And so what I did was, as I began to make photographs, and I made many images, of which this is really the only one that was even reasonably successful in my mind. The other images didn't work, at least in part, because that sense of movement wasn't really captured, or my composition really didn't quite work out in terms of the way the sheep moved through the space. It was really about that movement of sheep, movement of these paths of sheep through the space, and the way light and shadow interacted. I loved that big giant shadow cast by the huge tree in this early morning light. And I made a whole lot of photographs, and as I made photographs, I realized that making a still photograph of these animals was not really going to work very well. What I needed was something that allowed the movement of the animals through space, to be the creative element in the photograph. I've always been fascinated with moving things in still photographs, with blurred motion in photographs has always been something that's been very interesting to me. So what I found was that if I made some exposures, and of course I'm not really able to tell exactly what these things look like until much later, but I found that as I made some exposures that were in the half second to 1 second to 2 second range, that what I got was enough blurred motion to give this sense of these animals moving in a sort of almost stream or river-like fashion. And then when printing this photograph at a later time, I manipulate the image in such a way that the trails of the sheep are even somewhat more apparent by making sure that those sheep are kept quite light relative to the surrounding area, especially relative to the grasses in the foreground and the trees in the background, so that we perceive these ribbons of white light. So it was really a situation of thinking through the process of photography, the technology of photography, but really using that technology to visualize in my mind's eye the way the photograph would look once it was completed. In a sense, using that old idea of pre-visualization conceived by Weston and Adams to think through the process of how technology affects the way we can say and do things in photography. As a sort of an end note to this podcast episode, not necessarily photographic, but in a way I think it probably is, the group that I was staying with, eventually, of course, we became not friends necessarily, but acquainted with the shepherds who were driving these sheep around, and it was kind of interesting. They had named each and every one of them, which is sort of surprising given the large number of sheep that appear in this big group, this big herd. But toward the end of the week that we were staying in this particular place, the shepherds decided that they would butcher and roast one of the youngest of the sheep, one of the lambs, for us. And of course, that ensued a conversation of well over an hour about which of the flock would be the best best one to eat? Was it little Maria who would be the sweetest, or would it be Claudia who would be the sweetest of the sheep? So I think if there is a nugget of photographic truth in this story, the end part of this story about the shepherds and the sumptuous meal that they prepared, it is that photographs are about transitory experience. They capture a moment of the present, but always preserve it as a part of the past. All photographs, I think, are about the past. They are about a moment that is gone and not to be relived, but can be frozen in time through the photographic document. So what we have in this photograph is a moment that is about time. It's about the passage of time in front of the camera's lens, and it's about the passage of time in terms of how this ancient tradition of herding the sheep and caring for the animals of the land can be captured in a photographic document. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Camera Position. I appreciate those of you who have written in. I'm looking forward to hearing from more of you. Certainly feel free to drop me a note. Let me know what you think about Camera Position and any suggestions for improvement or change that might appeal to you. I'd be more than happy to hear about. Send me a note at jeff@jeffcurto.com or jeff@cameraposition.com. Until next time, keep shooting.